The People Like Us project is hosting a series of wellbeing and mental health chats with our partners from West London NHS. Today we are joined by Leah, an assistant psychologist from West London NHS Trust. Today she has joined us to discuss developing self-compassion, and during the session Leah will hopefully answer some of your questions you may have around this and will provide you with some wellbeing tips. As always, we would love to hear your feedback on the session and love to hear what you would want from topics from us. In the comments, we've added 2 short questions. Please like and comment with your feedback. But with that said, welcome, Aliyah.
Thank you, Nasim, for the introduction. My name is Alia. I'm an assistant psychologist with West London NHS. I work in the community rehab service team, which basically means that I support people who have complex mental health challenges as part of a multidisciplinary team. And today I've chosen self-compassion as my topic. And I'm hoping to just touch on some concepts that tend to get missed sometimes when we discuss things like self-compassion. So things like radical self-care, resilience, minority stress, things that are a bit more specific to some communities that we're hoping to make these concepts accessible to. This topic is really close to my heart. So if I go on and on, just stop me at any point.
Sure.
Um, Recently, I guess some of these words have become like kind of buzzwords, especially on social media. So things like self-love and self-care. But I wanted to take a deep dive into these concepts through a more intersectional lens. And just to give you a bit of a structure, I'm hoping to touch on what compassion is in general, how we define it, and then what we call the flow of compassion, and then we can discuss what the research tells us about self compassion, and then how we can develop it and how we can develop our compassionate selves. So, I guess in a sense, we can think of it as reflecting more on how we got stirred away from being compassionate and then how we can come back to being more compassionate towards ourselves. So, we basically, the simplest definition of compassion is how you feel for others and you tend to want to alleviate their suffering. Um, there's something that we call the flow of compassion, and it basically recognizes that there are three main types of compassion. And this is compassion that you can practice towards others, compassion that you can receive from others, and then compassion that you can give and receive yourself. Um, and it's kind of a cycle. And interestingly, we also know that these flows can influence each other. So we know that a person who receives compassion from others is more likely to be able to give more compassion to others as well. So this is really interesting when we start to reflect more on things like community building and belonging as well. The concept of compassion has originated from Buddhism initially, and then it was kind of integrated into the empirical research and health sciences by Dr. Kristen Neff. Her work is quite informative if you want to read more about the topic. And the research tells us a few really interesting things. So we know that people who practice more self compassion tend to be more resilient, more optimistic, they have better physical well being, higher academic performance, and they're more self forgiving. So these are all wonderful, wonderful benefits. But it also tends to decrease perceived stress, decrease levels of anxiety, shame. And another really interesting concept is that it decreases the act of self or social comparison. So people who practice self-compassion tend to not engage in comparing themselves to others, which can lead to being self-critical. Because when you do that repeatedly, you kind of focus or fixate on what's wrong with you or what you're lacking, which can also lead to things like procrastination, which I find quite interesting that it comes into that dynamic. And I guess to elaborate on some of these points, when we say perceived stress, it's quite relevant to studying and being a student as well, because it's people, all of us are under stress, especially students. They're under a lot of stress, and I guess it's about how you think of that stress. And if you think of it as something that exceeds your resources or coping abilities, then it can lead to self-criticism and shame and depression. But if you perceive that kind of stress as something that you have the tools to cope with, then this creates all the difference. And this is one of the benefits of self compassion. When we talk about physical wellness, it's also quite interesting to mention that compassion can suppress our sympathetic nervous system. And this basically means that the system that we have that can activate the fight or flight response gets suppressed, which means that we have lower levels of adrenaline and cortisol, which is quite interesting and quite helpful when you're thinking of things like stress and its effects, like palpitations or insomnia or restlessness. And finally, procrastination, because this is one of the things that I was really interested to know, is that sometimes the underlying reason of procrastination is fear of failure. So sometimes people tend to kind of self sabotage or leave things until the very last minute to protect themselves from feeling like they have failed in case they don't achieve what they want. So then when you don't achieve what you want, you can blame it on not having enough time or not having enough resources. Well, in fact, you had all the time to prepare. You just left it until the very last minute, and it's really really common when you kind of when you're so afraid of not achieving your best, which is a really common student experience as well. So, moving on from there, we need to think of what we can do and how we can be allies to ourselves. And Kristen Neff tells us that there are three, the fear of failure leads to procrastination. Yes, absolutely. And Kristen Neff tells us that there are three pillars of self compassion, and these are mindfulness, common humanity, and self kindness. They're all lovely words, but what do they mean actually? Um, and I think it's quite important to try and be aware of of the thought processes that you go through in your head and where they come from. So if we talk about mindfulness, for instance, just noticing things like the times when you feel safe or in control or empowered, so being mindful of places you feel safe in or people you feel safe when you're spending time with. What makes you feel empowered and who makes you feel empowered and why? What kind of things that do they do that kind of give you that sense of security? What situations drain you and what builds you up? So try to notice every time you feel drained or in control, empowered or anxious. The other thing is to try to notice when you're being a bit more vigilant or anxious, because it can be quite helpful to try and monitor that kind of process. So we know, for instance, that minority stress can cause us to be hypervigilant and always on the lookout for potential stressful events or potential discrimination or violence. And we know that minority stress can be an act of self-protection, and this kind of stress can help us avoid future inconveniences or traumas. So noticing the times you feel vigilant, noticing the times you feel isolated or lonely, or just noticing when you want to be alone, why you want to be alone as well. And I think if we think of it as a spectrum, some people are kind of, you notice they're always escaping their own company and they want distractions to be around all the time, which can tell you something. But also the other side of that spectrum, the opposite side, which is hyper independence and people who want to always be on their own and they think that they don't need anyone. which can be a trauma response, and it can be a method of self-protection from future disappointments. So this is another thing to be aware of. Being aware of your own self-critic as well. And we know that your self-critic almost always has origins in your developmental past. So trying to reflect on when you're or trying to notice just when you're being so critical or so mean towards yourself, whose voice is it and what are they saying? Is it related to messages you've received from politics or media or religion or family? And this ties in nicely with the next pillar, which is common humanity. So after you are aware of all these processes, trying to ground yourself and accept that this is part of the human experience and that this kind of suffering is common and you're not alone. And that being said, I just wanted to point out that I'm not I don't mean that all suffering is the same because this is absolutely not true. And the sources and intensities of suffering are different. But just trying to reflect on how this kind of suffering can be something that other people within your own community are going through. So, for instance, queer people can suffer a lot of rejection and exclusion from family. Some families have a culture of silence where they don't really talk about these things, and it becomes a bit of a shameful thing to discuss. There's some peer victimization and bullying within some communities. There's some discrimination due to bisexuality within the LGBT community. Um, when we think of cultures, there's this spectrum of shame, guilt, and fear, and different cultures are on different places and points on that spectrum. So noticing what we grew up with, if we were surrounded by fear or shame growing up, bringing that back to a more personal anecdote, maybe. Recently, I realized that personally, a lot of my own body shame came from growing up and coming from a culture that is Muslim and Arab. Womanhood is kind of pressured and equated with things like family honor and covering up with things like being respectful and being honorable. So these stresses always made me kind of hyper vigilant and hyper aware of how I use my body. And at some point I was so focused on just taking less space and making my body a bit smaller and less noticeable. So when I moved to London, I guess I also realized how this kind of body shame is something that I internalized, because being back home, I always thought that this kind of body shame and shame of womanhood was something that I rejected and was something that I was not agreeing with and not internalizing. But then I moved here and I realized that this internal script is still going on, even though I'm not back home anymore. So I guess just realizing the things that we grew up with and the things that we are surrounded with, even without really realizing it. These are can be subconscious processes that we're all vulnerable to. And I guess just yeah, I guess surrounding yourself with people who identify with these kinds of sufferings and people who relate to them, being mindful of the intersections that you live at. So intersections of racism and sexism are quite different than intersections of sexism and Islamophobia, for instance. So these kinds of intersections create different experiences and different traumas and triggers. So just being mindful of that, and it can be as simple as just following a few people on Instagram that have relatable content or relatable experiences to you, people who have been through some suffering and who can offer you some insight and hope, can be quite kind to yourself. So this is kind of the third pillar, just being kind. yourself, validating your own emotions. Because sometimes I guess we fall into the trap of waiting for external validation from others, and it can be quite painful if you're a minoritized community and there isn't a lot of validation sources. So just being your own validator is quite helpful. Accepting these experiences as human experiences and just asking yourself, what do I need to hear right now? And how can I express kindness to myself? Can be quite helpful. Um, so these are the three of pillars. They are a bit conceptual and they mean different things to different people. And I guess we do need to be mindful of that. That it's not a universal experience of just being self compassionate. It's quite personal and it's something you tailor to your own experience. And yeah, I guess this is what I wanted to basically encapsulate about self compassion. I can tell you a bit about some exercises or things that can help us be a bit more compassionate on day-to-day basis.
I think that would be
Um,
good. That would be
I'm,
great.
yeah, I'm checking. I don't think we have enough. We have any questions so far.
No.
Great. So we talked about how we got kind of stirred away from compassion and what stirred us away. So coming back to compassion can be in really simple acts. It doesn't have to be like energy or time consuming. So there's something called the self-compassion break, for instance. And this is just an exercise that encourages you to just pause if you feel quite stressed, for instance, or quite anxious. So just pause, be aware of this of emotional experience that you're going through. So just acknowledging that I'm now really stressed or I am really anxious and I'm not sure how to deal with this. Acknowledging that this kind of suffering is kind of suffering that other people are going through. Not everyone is, but some people are going through that same kind of experience. Um, and just being kind to yourself, asking yourself, what kind of thing can I do now to show a bit of kindness to myself? And it can be just listening to something you like, calling someone you admire, calling a family member, cooking a nice meal quickly for yourself in your study break. It can be is a really simple act, but in that context, it does become a kind of symbolic of that kindness that you want to extend to yourself. Another thing is called the self compassion journal, which can also be quite helpful. And you can do it every day, you can do it once a week, you can do it as for as long or as little as you want. And in that journal, you can write down anything that you feel bad about. So, for instance, say you got really angry at your mom for saying something that annoyed you. So, just being mindful first, writing down I was frustrated because she said this and that, which really annoyed me. I got angry and I overreacted and I feel foolish. So this can be the mindfulness part. And then the common humanity part would be to say something like everyone tends to overreact sometimes and it's fine. It's only human and it's okay. And then self kindness can be something like it's okay, I've messed up, but it's not the end of the world. And maybe tomorrow I can be a bit extra patient and generous with her. So this could be a really simple exercise to just help you reflect on this day-to-day practice that you can start to do effortlessly at some point. Some people just do this; they don't even need a journal. They practice so much, so it becomes like a language that they're fluent in. Um, so yeah, these are the kinds of things that do help, and sometimes people really struggle with being kind, and it's sometimes helpful to think something along the lines of, what would your best friend would tell you? What would your mom say to you in that situation? So just reflecting on what would someone say who's really compassionate towards you? How would they react to you? Or the other way around would be to just imagine your best friend going through this, and what would you tell them? And this becomes interesting because you start noticing how you are compassionate towards others, but you don't extend that kind of compassion towards yourself. So these are some exercises that can be really simple to follow, even on day-to-day basis. If you have 5 minutes, you're taking a study break, just try to do it and see how you feel afterwards. So
That's
yeah, I hope this is helpful. Um,
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. I mean, thank you for joining us, and all those tips are really useful. And I think everyone, even myself, will definitely try and practice them at one point, because we all need some more self-compassion. Um, yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for the session. We really appreciate your involvement. Um, Once again, if there's anyone watching from the University of West London, you can register online through our website for the People Like Us project. And as always, we would love to hear your feedback on the session. We'd love to hear on what you would like our other topics to be. In the comment section, we've added 2 short questions, so please do like and comment. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
And if anyone has any questions, I trust that they can just
Of
ask
course.
you guys. And
Yeah,
yeah, of course. Thank you for joining us, Maria.
thank you.